and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, every year we celebrate Merdeka, Malaya's Independence Day at the end of August, marking the start of what we now refer to as the post-colonial era for Malaysia. But is colonialism truly a thing of the past in Malaysia? Today on the show, we'll explore how colonial legacies continue to influence our collective consciousness and what it means to break free from these mental shackles. Joining me on the show today is Professor Alberto Gomes. He is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. He's also the Global Director of DEEP Network, which stands for Dialogue, Empathetic Engagement, and Peace Building. It's an academic collective that advocates for peace education. Professor Gomez's research over the years has largely focused on the impact of capitalism and modernity on indigenous communities, particularly the Orang Asli, whom he has studied since 1975. Welcome to the show, Professor Gomes. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you very much, I should say.
Most of us, I think, implicitly understand that the end of colonial administration does not necessarily mean the end of coloniality. So when you think about that, how do we think about the lasting impact colonialism has had on the Malaysian psyche and our kind of collective identity? If we can begin there.
Certainly. You're absolutely right about colonialism has not actually ended, and the concept that we use, the word we use is coloniality, which it delineates the afterlife of colonialism and the enduring legacies and the continuing effects of colonialism. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is that colonialism is a structure, it's not an event, and this is. In fact, this is something that the late Patrick Wolf, who is in fact a good friend of mine and passed away quite some time ago, and he published a book entitled Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native. And in fact, this is the book that he uses. It was actually focused on the First Nations people in Australia, known as the Australian Aboriginal people. However, he has also, and the book was published quite some time ago, in 2011, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and it touches on what we are witnessing today, in Gaza. It touches on settler colonialism and the elimination of natives. So when we speak about coloniality as a structure and not an event, then we begin to see its various manifestations of the effects of colonialism today. So the perpetuation of Eurocentrism, the Western domination, white supremacy, white privilege. These are all, the different forms of manifestations. The hierarchies of race, gender, and geopolitics. So when you look at Malaysia today, these three different hierarchical structures are pretty much prevalent, pervasive, and they are continuing effects. They're debilitating in a sense. Yeah?
Can I explore the one of the pillars that you mentioned of race, the effects of colonialism on Malaysians' understanding of self and otherness? How do we think about that, particularly through the lens of race, which seems to be applied onto everything in Malaysia?
Yes, indeed. As you probably know, the race is a concept. It's something that is fictitious. I mean, it's fallacious to speak about race, and it's socially constructed concept. And so what has happened is that races existed for a very long time, but it was not conceptualized in the way we think about race today. So when we look at the colonialism, it became a very interesting trope, a very interesting kind of, I would say, a tool to divide the people. So that's what has happened. when the British had arrived and divided, Malaysians into all these different races. So if we are really wanting to decolonize, then an important thing is not just decolonizing our minds, but it is actually decolonizing the material conditions that continue to keep our mental, sort of our minds, the way we think about the world in the colonial way, the colonial logic. So race is certainly one of the many. Yeah? And in order to deal with race in Malaysia, I think it's really important to understand, where it comes from, the roots of the kind of racial division that exists, which is essentially the colonial. And if you want to decolonize, you must begin to refuse that sort of division that has existed during the colonial period. And once you continue to consider it to be important in your daily lives, in the way you relate to one another, the way you think about, the other in Malaysia, then basically my point is that this is the talk that I'm going to give tomorrow. Basically, it means that the virus is still there. It's still
the colonial virus.
The colonial virus. And so it continues to debilitate us. We need to heal from it, but if we're going to heal from it, because the virus itself causes what we call the colonial sickness.
Tell me more. What is the colonial sickness?
So the colonial sickness, it's manifested in so many different ways. The hierarchies of race, gender, the fact that people are divided along these kinds of hierarchical structures that have been established and accentuated, in fact, reinforced during the colonial period. Now, the colonizers did not sort of create, gender. They did not come and construct it or race, but they used it. The most important thing about colonialism is to divide and rule and conquer, yeah, and that's how the colonial masters, if you want to put inverted commas around that word, what they have in fact very effectively done is to divide people on the basis of all these different categories, of inequalities. So you have caste, color, which is a metonym or metaphor for race, and then you have, class, which is related to capitalism. And when we speak about colonialism, it's not just colonialism that we are concerned about, but the material conditions of colonialism is capitalism. And the colonial capitalism that comes together, and they have worked, it's hand in glove, if you want to put it that way. But they've worked in such a marvelous way in terms of ensuring. See, Melisa, one of the problems I have, probably I'm cognitively challenged, or perhaps I suffer from some cognitive disorder, is I think in totograms. So these are all words that begin with the same letter.
Color, class, caste, C, colonialism, capitalism.
Yep. And country, yeah.
And country.
And country is the word that I use as a metaphor or a metonym for states. And the controversial thing I'm going to say is that people think about the state and they think about the nation or territory or whatever word that they're going to use in connection to the word country, but ultimately the state is racializing. The state is also one that is closely connected to capitalism, and the primary role of the state is to keep the order intact precisely for colonial capitalism.
So modern day states perpetuate the practices of colonialism.
They do, but they also the conduit. So they are, in fact, the state operates in such a way that the colonial state was established at that time. And the colonial state, and you've got to also remember that many of the colonial establishments that were set up, they were actually corporations. So you have the
business side of things, the capitalist side of things. Can I ask you, Professor, how the remnants of colonialism has permeated education the education system, because I think at the heart of everything, we talk about culture and society, but when we think about our education system, it goes down to the very grassroots. How does that permeate how does colonialism permeate our education system?
It's certainly another tool, that's used by colonialism. So when we speak about education, and especially in the Malaysian context, and I don't want to say so much about it because I know that there are specialists who can speak a lot deeper about but from a general perspective, when we speak about education, what are we actually doing? Are we teaching our students how to think or what to think? And so you find that a lot of education is essentially just continuing, the kind of the discourse or the various sorts of, teaching the students what to think. So this is how, you must think about something. These are the concepts that you're going to, use in order to understand this phenomenon. And you don't teach your students how to think critically. So they don't ask the questions that deserve to be asked, So they just accept things as they are. And that fits in perfectly in the colonial logic.
What would be the main question to ask if we were to critically think about how to begin dismantling a colonized mind?
The first, I think we got to begin with thinking of how, colonialism, the colonial mentality. I think it was Syed Hussein, well, not a thing, but Syed Hussein Alatas, for example, speaks about the captive mind or the shackled mind.
Shackled mind.
And the point here is that, so you got to be conscious of how it has impacted you and how it has affected your thinking initially. And sometimes it is not entirely straightforward to do that, precisely because it is so deeply entrenched, it's embedded in our thinking that you don't really see how it has, it has shaped the way you think about the world. So the first thing to do is, start reading, read anti-colonial books by anti-colonial writers, read Frank Fanon and see how it has affected, our psychological minds. Read, African writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and also, read the work of Syed Hussein Alatas. I mean, how many Malaysians can you say would have read any of his work, Or a friend of mine who very sadly passed away just last week, Professor Syed Hussein Ali, And when you read their work, you begin to ask, certain kinds of questions that you may not have thought about, And so that's where I believe it's really important to start. Now, a lot of what I have learned, I would say, or perhaps unlearned is the more precise word, is from my reading and from the long association that I've had with the Orang Asli and the indigenous peoples. So recently I've had the opportunity, pleasure, in fact, of teaching a course at the University of the Philippines in Baguio. And the course is offered to PhD students in indigenous studies. And my course is, I entitled my course Coloniality, Capitalism, and Indigenous Decoloniality.
Wow.
Okay, all these big words that usually academics use these words to, to obfuscate, what is actually very simple and straightforward. But anyway, I started reading a great deal, mainly from Maori, from Native Americans, Canadian Indians, and they have written marvelous. I can't remember how many books I've read in a year, possibly about 20 or so of these indigenous writers, and it the thing about the indigenous peoples. So you have got, say, Native Americans, or not. Especially the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So their lives have changed from 1492. for 500 years, more than 500 years, they had to deal with the juggernaut of colonialism, the Spanish, Portuguese, and subsequently, from the Anglo countries. And the amazing thing is that, back to Patrick Wolf and the elimination of the native, there was so much attempt to wipe them out, to eliminate the indigenous peoples. You read the atrocities that were perpetrated, committed against the indigenous peoples. It's horrific. But they have not been wiped out. They are still here. The very fact that the indigenous peoples continue not just to exist, but to thrive, should be a lesson to all of us, that they must be doing something that keeps, their...
Well, often research into indigenous people's lives are always about their lives and not to learn from their lives.
Exactly.
So what can we learn from indigenous people's lives that can help us decolonize our own minds?
Okay, that's a very good point, Melisa, because I've been talking about this for a very long time. Occasionally I get, when I give talks in Malaysia, almost invariably someone will ask me a question, a reporter, a journalist. So how can we help the Orang Asli? And I would turn the question and I say, I think it's about time that you think about how can the Orang Asli help us. I'm speaking about the ecological problems we have, the problems that we have of violence. So when you look at all these, I'm just giving you two. I've got so many, different examples that I can provide you. But when you just look at these two, colonialism is a system, a structure that perpetuates violence.
Oh.
Okay, so it is, when I speak about the colonial virus is a killing virus. When we speak about genocide, that is killing people. When we speak about epistemicide, that's killing knowledge.
Wow.
When we speak about culture and culturaliside, that's killing cultures, yeah?
It's destructive.
Destructive, exactly. And that's the colonial logic, The colonial logic is to do with what we call creative destructionism. So you destroy something and then you create something in the mold that you have set. So they've done that right throughout the world. They've destroyed what exists there.
Natural resources.
Exactly. And you look at India, you destroy the textiles, you destroy everything about India. In Malaysia, you have had wonderful, systems. So the Orang Asli, that's one, the violence. But the most important thing for me, as a greenie, I would say, I don't look so much as a greenie, but I would say my concern is with what we refer to as the ecological rift, and how, as humans, we have separated ourselves, alienated ourselves from nature. Okay? And Orang Asli, from the thing that I learned from the time that I spent with the Orang Asli, is respecting nature. That's the fundamental, I would say, the root, the source of our existence. And for them, the forest is not just, mainstream society think about the forest, okay, lots of timber, we're going to, or maybe it'll be a good place to have a plantation,
Right.
So
you think of it in those terms, right? Monetary terms, and what value can we extract from it?
Precisely, and you convert the forest into an economic product, a commodity. But for Orang Asli, it's not. The forest is history, because for them, when we think about history, we think about history in the connection of what we call time and temporal consciousness of history. So if I ask you, Melisa, what happened at certain time, and it's often related to a date. What did you do in say in 1995, or if you were born then.
Yes, I was.
But but you don't. But orang asli don't think in those terms. Yeah, they don't think in what we call temporal consciousness of history. For them, history is spatialized. Yeah? So when I was doing my research, I was very interested in taking taking down, sort of recording what happened in the past in their lives, the oral histories. And I kept asking them, so this thing happened, this person passed away. When did it happen? You talk about this flood. When did it happen? Yeah? And they would just shrug their shoulders and say, no, do not know. When? And one day, when I was walking in the forest with them, and they said to me, do you remember that slave raiding story I told you? And I said, yes, I do. This is where they sharpened their knives on this rock.
Oh, it's connected to a place, a space.
Space. So it's spatialized. And then I realized that a walk in the forest with them was a journey into their past. Because every tree
has a story.
Every rock, every hill. And so the forest for them is like the British Museum, or the archives,
Right.
Because,
If you think about that in kind of modern day society, where we don't cherish or treasure those values, it feels very far removed from daily life. But how do we take those lessons or those principles and apply it to our lives if we want to fight the colonial virus within ourselves?
Yes, and this is one of the things to realize. I think it's important to, first of all, to make note of where the problem lies and how the problem has been produced or created. So the next thing to do is then look for ways. How are you going to remember? Okay, so the word remember means how are you going to member. It's two words. Remember. So how are you going to bring that member back to your own lives? Yeah? And then trace the different parts. Walk through Kuala Lumpur, not looking at just the buildings, but look at Kuala Lumpur and try to remember the spaces that you walk through, and try to plot how the connections of the people are related to those places. So back to your question about decolonizing. The issue, Melisa, with decolonizing is that it's become an intellectual fad. It's an academic.
Oh.
It's fashionable. Everyone is wanting to decolonize this, decolonize that. So I would not actually use the word decolonizing. I would think that it is. I would probably choose the word counter-hegemony.
Counter-hegemony.
Okay, hegemony is where our ideas have been dominated to the extent that we think that and you think that it's natural.
Right.
Often you say, "Oh, this is common sense,"
There's only one way to be.
Yes, right? And when one speaks about common sense, always remember that one person's common sense could be someone else's nonsense. So the point here is that you need to sort of think about, is this really common sense? Ask the question, or is there some other senses, that you want to think about, and I gave you the idea of the example, I should say, of history, and how we think about history. So begin to explore other possibilities of speaking, and these possibilities, Melisa, they are not sort of possibilities that are presented in books, or they are there. It's just a member of it's just a matter of going back, talking to people about the past. But when you talk about the people of the past, it's not just plotting it on a yearly sort of scale, but actually to to walk along the path, you know, with people who know about the past. So, you know, walking through history. Now, all that is, you know, indigenous knowledge.
Practices, yeah.
Practice.
It's the way they live, right?
Yes, the way they live. And I think it's really important if we want to deal with the bigger, the existentialist problems that humans are facing at the moment, whether it's climate change or ecological degradation. The most important thing to keep in mind is that why this is happening is largely because, you know, nature has been converted into a resource.
Professor, we could talk for another hour or so about this, but I want to thank you for opening up this conversation, helping us think through and question what we've accepted for so long. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, thank you, Melisa.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.